Charlie Kirk walked onto the university debate stage like a man who had already won. The founder of Turning Point USA had done this hundreds of times, campus after campus, confrontation after confrontation, always the same result. He commanded the stage with the confidence of someone who knew the script by heart, who had reduced political debate to a series of rehearsed zingers and audience applause lines. His opening remarks that evening were delivered with the casual dismissiveness of a veteran performer going through familiar motions. When the moderator introduced Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett as his debate opponent, something flickered across Kirk's face. Not concern, but the kind of theatrical surprise a magician shows when confronted with an audience volunteer. He adjusted his microphone and smiled the smile of a man about to educate someone on how the world really works. Kirk's opening statement was a masterclass in what he did best. He spoke directly to the camera, barely acknowledging Crockett's presence on the opposite podium. He referenced his organization's reach on college campuses, the millions who followed his daily show, the influence he wielded over young conservative voters. He spoke about credentials, his years building a movement, his direct access to Republican leadership, his role in shaping the party's future. Then he turned, finally, to address Crockett directly. His tone shifted to something gentler, almost paternal. He acknowledged her recent election to Congress, called her passionate, complimented her energy. Then came the pivot. He noted her relative inexperience in Washington, her limited time in office, her background as a civil rights attorney rather than someone who had, as he put it, built institutions from the ground up. The audience, heavily populated with Turning Point student activists, responded exactly as Kirk knew they would. He had established the terrain. He was the builder, the institution, the voice of millions. She was the newcomer, the passionate advocate, the person who meant well but perhaps did not fully understand how power actually operated in America. The stage was his. The framework was set. He was ready for a familiar performance. Crockett stood at her podium with perfect stillness. She wore a navy suit with a white blouse, her hair pulled back, her expression neutral. She had not reacted to Kirk's opening dismissal with the defensive energy he had clearly anticipated. She had not interrupted, had not shown frustration, had not done any of the things that would have allowed him to cast her as emotional or unprepared. Instead, she had taken notes. Careful, methodical notes in a leather portfolio that sat open on her podium. When Kirk finished his opening remarks and the moderator turned to her for response, she did something unexpected. She thanked him. She thanked him for his years of activism, for building an organization that engaged young people in politics, for his willingness to debate rather than simply preach to audiences that already agreed with him. The audience, uncertain how to respond to this graciousness, remained quiet. Then she said something that would haunt Kirk for the rest of the evening. She said she had been hoping for this opportunity for quite some time. She said she had a few questions about the institutions he had built, the influence he claimed to wield, and the records that came with both. She said she had done some homework. Then she opened the first folder. The folder was dark blue with tabbed sections visible along the right edge. She opened it with the deliberate care of someone handling evidence that had been organized for maximum impact. She began with a simple establishment of fact. She noted that Kirk often spoke about Turning Point USA's budget, their reach on college campuses, their ability to organize students and influence elections. She asked if that characterization was fair. Kirk, clearly pleased to talk about his organizational success, confirmed it enthusiastically. Yes, Turning Point had raised tens of millions of dollars. Yes, they had chapters on hundreds of campuses. Yes, they had become a significant force in conservative politics. Crockett listened, nodded, made a note. Then she asked her first real question. She asked Kirk if he could confirm that Turning Point USA was registered as a 5011c3 nonprofit organization, meaning it was tax-exempt and prohibited from direct campaign activity. Kirk, sensing no trap in the question, confirmed it. Of course they were. That was standard for educational nonprofits. Crockett made another note. Then she opened the folder to a marked page and read aloud from what she identified as Turning Point USA's own publicly filed tax documents. She read the organization's stated mission, promoting free markets, limited government, and fiscal responsibility through campus education programs. Kirk nodded. That was correct. Then she asked him to confirm that tax-exempt nonprofits like his organization were legally prohibited from using their resources to directly coordinate with political campaigns or to function as campaign vehicles. Kirk's expression shifted slightly. He said that of course he knew the law, that Turning Point operated entirely within legal bounds, that they engaged in educational advocacy, not campaign coordination. His voice carried the first edge of defensiveness, the first signal that the script was not unfolding as anticipated. Crockett reached for a second folder, this one red with multiple tabbed sections. She explained that she had filed Freedom of Information Act requests with several universities where Turning Point had hosted campus events. She noted that FOIA responses often took months, but that public universities were required to disclose communications with outside political organizations that used campus facilities. Kirk's face had lost some of its earlier confidence. She opened the red folder and pulled out what she described as email correspondence between Turning Point staff and university administrators. She read from the first email, dated 8 months before a gubernatorial election, in which a Turning Point regional director requested specific dates for campus events designed to, in the email's own words, maximize student turnout for Republican candidates in the upcoming election. Kirk interrupted. He said those were campus activism events, not campaign rallies, that students had every right to organize politically. Crockett did not argue. She simply turned to the next tabbed section and read from a second email, this one from Turning Point's national office to campus chapter leaders, providing talking points about specific Democratic candidates and encouraging students to share opposition research on social media before early voting began. Kirk's hands gripped the edges of his podium. He said that sharing information was not campaigning, that students were expressing their own views, that Turning Point simply provided educational resources. Crockett acknowledged his point. Then she introduced the comparative chart. She explained that she had examined the tax filings of 10 major nonprofit advocacy organizations across the political spectrum, 5 conservative, 5 progressive, all claiming 501c3 tax-exempt status for educational work. She had compared their disclosed activities, their event calendars, their public communications against the legal standards established by the IRS for maintaining tax-exempt status. She noted that most of these organizations operated in a gray area, that political advocacy often brushed up against legal lines, that enforcement was inconsistent. Then she noted the outlier. She said that of the 10 organizations examined, only one showed a pattern of documented coordination between claimed educational events and specific electoral outcomes that appeared to cross from advocacy into direct campaign support. Turning Point USA. Kirk's voice rose. He called it a partisan attack. He said progressive nonprofits did the exact same thing. He said the entire system was rigged against conservative voices. Crockett waited until he finished. Then she opened a third folder, this one black, and pulled out a document she identified as a whistleblower complaint filed with the IRS 14 months earlier by a former Turning Point employee. The complaint alleged that Turning Point maintained 2 internal calendars, one public, showing educational seminars and campus debates, and one internal, coordinating those events with Republican campaign schedules to maximize electoral impact while maintaining the appearance of educational programming. Kirk said the complaint was from a disgruntled former employee who had been fired for cause. Crockett asked if that meant the complaint was false. Kirk hesitated. He said he had never seen any such complaint, that Turning Point had legal counsel that ensured compliance, that accusations were not evidence. Crockett did not press him. Instead, she introduced the human consequence. She said she wanted to share something that had been sent to her office 3 weeks earlier. She described a letter from a graduate student at a public university in Arizona who had been a member of Turning Point's campus chapter. The student had attended what was advertised as an educational seminar on economic policy. The seminar had been held 6 weeks before a Senate election. The student described being given printed materials comparing the 2 candidates, being coached on phone banking techniques, being provided with scripts for voter contact that explicitly supported the Republican candidate. The student had asked a campus advisor whether the activity violated university rules about partisan political organizing using campus resources. The advisor had investigated and discovered that Turning Point had registered the event as an educational nonprofit seminar, which allowed them to use campus facilities at no cost and without the disclosure requirements that would apply to campaign-related activities. When the student attempted to report the discrepancy, they faced retaliation from other Turning Point members and eventually left the organization. The university, not wanting controversy, had quietly updated its policies but taken no action. Crockett read portions of the student's letter slowly, letting each detail accumulate. Kirk had gone silent. His earlier bluster had evaporated. He started to speak twice, stopped both times, then said that he could not comment on anonymous allegations about individual chapters. Crockett closed the black folder and set it aside. She said she understood his reluctance to comment on specific allegations. She said she wanted to return to something broader, something he had opened his remarks with, his claim of institutional credibility, his assertion that he had built something lasting, something that operated with integrity. She noted that he had questioned her credentials, had suggested that her relative inexperience in Congress meant she did not fully understand how institutions worked. Then she asked him a question that seemed almost gentle in its simplicity. She asked him if an organization that claimed tax-exempt status for educational work while systematically coordinating that work with partisan campaign goals was operating with integrity, or whether it was simply exploiting a legal loophole that most organizations were too ethical to abuse. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Kirk's mouth opened but no sound emerged. He looked down at his notes, looked back up at Crockett, looked toward his staff seated in the front row. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. The only sound in the auditorium was the hum of the camera equipment and the occasional scrape of a pen as reporters continued taking notes. Someone in the audience coughed, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the sustained quiet. Kirk finally managed words, but they were fragments, half-formed defenses that went nowhere. He said something about progressive organizations, something about legal advice, something about educational mission. None of it landed. None of it answered the question. Crockett waited until it was clear he had nothing else to offer. Then she moved to the final folder. This folder was thin, white, with a single document inside. Crockett explained that it was a letter she had drafted that afternoon and had not yet decided whether to send. The letter was addressed to the IRS commissioner, formally requesting an investigation into whether Turning Point USA's activities warranted review of its tax-exempt status. She noted that such requests were public record once filed, that they triggered mandatory review processes, that organizations under IRS investigation faced donor scrutiny and potential loss of tax-exempt privileges. She had not sent it yet. She said she was not certain it was necessary. She said she believed in giving people the opportunity to explain themselves before making allegations formal. Then she asked Kirk a second question, equally simple. She asked him if he wanted to take this opportunity on camera in front of students who looked up to him as a model of principled conservatism to clarify whether everything he had just defended about Turning Point's operations was something he believed genuinely served educational purposes, or whether he personally knew, that some of what his organization did crossed legal and ethical lines but continued anyway because the electoral results justified the methods. The question hung in the air. It was a trap with no exit. A yes answer was a confession. A no answer was a lie that the evidence she had just presented would immediately disprove. A non-answer was an admission of guilt through silence. Kirk stared at the letter in Crockett's hand. His face had gone from its earlier confident flush to something pale and drawn. His hands left the podium and hung at his sides. 23 seconds of absolute silence. No one in the auditorium moved. Kirk's own supporters sat frozen, uncertain whether to defend him or distance themselves. Finally, Kirk spoke. He said that he had always operated in good faith, that if mistakes had been made, they were not intentional, that he would review the concerns she had raised. His voice had none of its earlier authority. It was the voice of someone who had just realized he had walked into an ambush and had no way out. Crockett set the white folder down, the letter still inside, unsigned. She did not gloat. She did not celebrate. She simply acknowledged his statement and said she hoped that review would be genuine and thorough. Then she returned to the opening dismissal. She reminded the audience that Kirk had begun the evening by questioning her credentials, by suggesting that her background as a civil rights attorney and her brief time in Congress meant she did not understand institutions or power. She noted that she had spent her entire career representing people who had been exploited by institutions that looked legitimate on paper but operated with corruption underneath. She had investigated churches that sheltered abuse, businesses that stole wages, nonprofits that funneled money meant for communities into personal enrichment. She had learned that the most dangerous institutions were not the ones that openly broke laws, but the ones that found the gaps between legal and ethical and built empires in those gaps. She said she understood institutions perfectly well. What Kirk had built was not an institution. It was a shell game dressed in patriotic language, a tax-exempt vehicle for partisan campaigning that hid behind the claim of education. And the reason she had been able to dismantle his defense so completely in a single evening was not because she was some brilliant legal mind. It was because he had been arrogant enough to believe that documentation did not matter, that questions from a black woman in Congress could be brushed aside with condescension, that confidence could substitute for integrity. Kirk stood at his podium, visibly shaken. He attempted a closing statement, but it was incoherent, a rambling defense that referenced progressive hypocrisy, media bias, persecution of conservative voices. None of it addressed the evidence Crockett had presented. None of it answered the questions she had asked. When his time ended, he walked off the stage without shaking her hand, without acknowledging the moderator, without the triumphant wave to his supporters that typically ended these events. His staff rushed to follow him. The auditorium remained silent for several long moments after he disappeared through the exit. Then, slowly, a portion of the audience, not the Turning Point activists, but students who had come expecting a typical political debate and had instead witnessed something closer to a deposition, began to applaud. It was not loud, but it was sustained. Crockett gathered her folders, stacked them neatly, and placed them in a leather briefcase. She thanked the moderator, thanked the audience for their attention, and left the stage with the same composed stillness she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. The video of the debate went viral within hours. Not the full 90-minute event, but the specific moments Crockett had designed to be shareable. The opening dismissal, the FOIA email revelation, the 23-second silence, the final callback to credentials. Each clip functioned as a complete narrative package, requiring no additional context to deliver its emotional impact. Turning Point's social media team attempted damage control, framing the debate as a partisan ambush, claiming the evidence was selectively edited, suggesting Crockett had violated debate rules by bringing prepared materials. None of it gained traction. The footage was too clear. Kirk's collapse had been too visible. The questions had been too simple and his inability to answer them too devastating. Within 72 hours, 3 major donors to Turning Point USA had quietly paused their contributions pending internal review. 2 universities announced they were examining their policies on nonprofit use of campus facilities. The IRS, whether prompted by Crockett's letter or by the sudden public attention, opened a preliminary inquiry into Turning Point's tax-exempt status. Kirk himself disappeared from social media for nearly a week, an unprecedented silence for someone who typically posted dozens of times daily. What had happened on that stage was not a political debate. It was a systematic dismantling of the persona Kirk had spent years constructing. He had built his career on the performance of competence, on the claim that conservative institutions operated with the integrity that progressive organizations lacked. Crockett had not argued against that claim. She had simply documented the gap between the claim and the reality. She had let him confirm his own statements, establish his own credibility, defend his own organization. Then she had presented evidence that every defense he offered was either incomplete or false. She had given him opportunities to clarify, to explain, to provide context that might soften the implications of what the documents showed. He had not taken those opportunities because no good answers existed. An organization claiming educational tax exemption while coordinating with partisan campaigns was either ignorant of the law or deliberately violating it. Kirk could not claim ignorance without destroying his credibility as an institutional leader. He could not admit intent without confessing to tax fraud. The trap had been perfect because it required no rhetorical skill to spring, only documentation and patience. The broader lesson, the one that extended beyond Kirk and Turning Point, was about the nature of institutional accountability in American politics. Thousands of organizations on both sides of the political spectrum operated in the gray areas between legal advocacy and illegal campaign coordination. Most faced no consequences because the IRS lacked resources to investigate every complaint, because universities did not want controversy, because donors cared more about electoral results than ethical methods. What Crockett had demonstrated was that accountability did not require systemic reform or new regulations. It required someone willing to do the homework. It required filing the FOIA requests, reading the tax documents, tracking the patterns, organizing the evidence into a narrative structure that could not be dismissed or deflected. It required refusing to accept institutional legitimacy at face value and instead insisting that institutions prove they operated with the integrity they claimed. Most importantly, it required the discipline to stay calm, to present facts rather than opinions, to let the evidence speak rather than shouting over it. Kirk had walked onto that stage believing he controlled the narrative because he always controlled the narrative. He had controlled it through volume, through confidence, through the performance of authority. Crockett had taken that control by refusing to compete on his terms. She had not tried to outshout him or match his theatrical energy. She had simply asked him to explain his own documented actions. When he could not, when 23 seconds of silence made clear that no explanation existed that would not incriminate him, the performance collapsed. What remained was not a confident institutional leader but a man who had been caught operating a legal shell game and had just realized that someone had bothered to look inside the shell. The viral clips, the donor withdrawals, the IRS inquiry, these were not the result of a brilliant rhetorical victory. They were the inevitable consequence of arrogance meeting preparation. Kirk had believed documentation did not matter because no one had ever held him accountable for it before. Crockett had proved that documentation was the only thing that mattered, that all the confidence and charisma and institutional credibility in the world collapsed the moment someone asked a simple question and waited for an answer that could not come. She had not destroyed Charlie Kirk because she was smarter or more skilled at debate. She had destroyed him because she had done the work he had assumed no one would bother doing. She had treated his claims of institutional integrity not as settled fact, but as hypotheses requiring evidence, when the evidence showed the opposite, when his own organization's documents contradicted his public statements, when his own emails revealed coordination he claimed never happened. He had no defense available except silence. And silence, in a man who had built his career on never shutting up, was the most damning confession of all. The evening had begun with Kirk questioning whether a civil rights attorney with limited time in Congress understood how institutions worked. It ended with that same attorney demonstrating that she understood institutions better than he did, understood them well enough to dismantle one in 90 minutes using nothing more than its own paperwork and a series of questions that had no good answers. That was not partisan politics. That was not a difference of opinion. That, as Crockett had noted in her closing statement, was just accountability. And accountability, it turned out, was something Charlie Kirk's institution could not survive.